Alright guys, welcome back to another project. So in this one we're going to be making a few scrapbooks that I'm going to be giving to my family as Christmas gifts. Now I know it's a little late to be posting a video about Christmas gifts given that it's already the new year, but I wanted to make sure that for one I didn't spoil the gifts, and two I was able to put together a very comprehensive video of how to do this. And so the idea here is I wanted to make something that both my sister's family and my mom and dad would have for a very long time. So I wanted to make sure I put in the effort and make something that is both beautiful and ultimately very functional. And so the idea here is that we're going to be using some solid walnut panels to make both the front and back cover, and then we're going to be using some nice leather to create the hinge and some really nice paper to fill the inside. And so the whole design of these things is that they're meant to be very easy to add and remove pages from, which you'll see in a little while how I achieve that. But basically, yeah, I wanted to make sure that you didn't have to have this awkwardly large book open when you're trying to work on an individual page. Now, as I was working on the design, one of the things I came up with was including a whole bunch of texture in these covers. So one of the first ideas that I had was going through and stippling the front cover for the book for my mom and dad. Now, stippling is a fairly interesting technique. Basically, you're using a small gouge, or you could use a larger gouge, just depending on how large or how small you want the texture to be. But basically, you just go through and make a whole bunch of small cuts. Now this piece of wood is about 11.5 by 17.5 inches wide, so as I'm sure you can imagine, this took a long time. But surprisingly enough, it wasn't nearly as painful as I thought it was going to be. Now that being said, I probably wouldn't use this technique to do like a giant door panel or anything like that in the future, but I do want to try and find some way to incorporate this into a piece of furniture somehow. Because what I really like about this texture is it takes a completely flat panel like what I'm working with here and just creates all this different depth and lighting contrast to the wood. And you still get to see the beautiful wood grain and all the natural colors of the wood come through. So it's a really interesting technique to add some tactile feel to a piece of flat wood. You can see that when I go through and burnish it with some steel wool, it really just highlights all those little individual ridges and it really brings the color in. When it came to choosing the right leather for this project, I had to actually go to Tandy Leather and play around with a few of the different hides that they had sitting around there. Because most of the leather working that I've done in the past, I've worked with oak veg tan leather, which is typically used in things like saddles or footwear. It's a very hard, very tough type of leather that doesn't bend and move very easily. So when I went to Tandy, I went and tried to feel around, played around with a few different of the hides that they had there, and just tried to find something that was a little bit softer and would flex a little bit easier and could work as a hinge like I'm going to be using it here. And so the hide that I chose is a Kodiak side, which is oil tanned leather. Again, I don't really know what all that means. All I know is that it's soft, flexible, and it feels really nice. So you get that really nice tactile feel. One of the downsides to this leather that I chose is that you couldn't tool the edges very nicely. Typically with leather you'd go in and chamfer the edges and that cleans them up a little bit. But with this leather, because it's so soft, you just couldn't do that. But I found that if you just hold it over a blowtorch for a few seconds, it just crisps up the edge and makes it a little bit easier to work with. To temporarily attach everything together, I'm just using a little bit of LePage contact cement. Now this is just about the cheapest contact cement you can buy, but all I needed to do here is hold the leather in place temporarily until I can stitch it all together. For that purpose, it worked just fine. If I was actually trying to glue the leather to the wood and just leave it with just glue and not do any stitching to it, I would probably go and get some more expensive contact cement or find a little bit more of a permanent solution, because this contact cement, even though I used a good amount of it, even though I followed all the instructions on the can, it still had a tendency to kind of peel off even when I wasn't working it or drilling holes into it. So it was definitely not a great option if you're just going to be gluing the leather directly to the wood, but in this case it worked well to kind of temporarily clamp the leather to the wood. And so before we can go and glue on the main piece of leather that's going to act as the hinge, I wanted to do this first line of stitching on this just front detail piece of leather. Because what I really want is that when I glue on that back piece of leather that's going to be acting as the hinge, I don't want to have a stitch line going through the middle of it. So if you don't want to take that extra step and you just kind of want to get it all together, you could definitely just have a stitch line going right through the middle of your inside piece. It really wouldn't be that big of a deal. But for me, I wanted to try and hide it. So I'm going to be going through, laying out all my holes, taking it over to the drill press, drilling each of these holes individually, which this took a very long time, and then stitching this piece. And this will allow me to completely hide that stitch on the inside of the cover. Now, yes, if you're wondering, this is just about the most painstaking process I have ever imagined myself doing, and I probably will never do anything like this again. Between the 3 covers that I did for this, it was, I don't even know how many hours spent at the drill press, just constantly moving that bit up and down. And so for the stitching, I did a completely traditional saddle stitch, with the 2 needles going back and forth. This is a very, very strong stitch, and this leather is, pretty much permanently attached to this wood at this point. And so this little piece you're seeing me work on now is what is going to be our fixed hinge area. So this is the same piece of the main panel that I just cut off the very edge. Now, it's really important to have sharp tools at this point. My block plane is freshly sharpened because I'm chamfering that end grain, and that whole long edge of this piece is end grain. So one of the downsides to the way that these books are set up is that this hinge area is made with pretty much the worst possible grain direction. But what I found through a little bit of testing is that when you put it under enough pressure, with the way we're going to be using binding bolts to hold this whole thing together, it actually is pretty strong. I a couple of times during this project, I did accidentally drop these books, and I never really had to worry about that end grain cracking because it just seemed to hold up just fine. So one of the biggest concerns I had was having that long end grain piece on there, but it turned out to really not be that big of a deal. And so when I was researching how to actually make a book, whether you're using wood or other natural mediums, one of the most important things I found is jig making. So I put together this pretty thick, pretty hefty jig that was going to help me align everything, because what was most important is that my holes all line up and everything comes together nicely. Now, the only time that this jig really mattered was when I was drilling my hinge holes. So there's going to be 3 holes right in that long side section, but they all need to be perfectly aligned between the front, the back cover, and all the paper that I'm going to be putting in this book. And so this jig helps fit everything perfectly in place and holds it tightly so I can put it under pressure when I'm going into it with the drill press. You'll get to see how this works in a little bit here, but it is very important to have everything, really tight and really well under pressure. But before I can do all that, I have to go through and do the stitching work. So I'm using these leather punches to just go through and mark out my hole locations. This was the best way I figured out to do this. There was other ways that I tried, but none of them seemed to work as well as just going through and marking out these holes. These holes didn't really weren't really deep enough to actually guide the drill bit into place. They were just kind of there enough to just give me a visual key as to where to drill. And so I started with the cover that I was making for myself because I figured that if I screwed up, it would be the best one to be, to just call a learning circumstance. It's not something I'm going to be giving as a gift to someone. And so I thought that if I put both the front and back covers into the jig, I could just use that to then drill all of my holes at once. And it would say, it'd be about half as much work. What ended up happening, and I didn't realize this until I was completely done because I didn't want to move anything, in case I'd misaligned something, is that the backside blew out horribly. So even though it technically should have been a 0 clearance fit, because this was the first time drilling all these holes into that bottom piece of MDF, it didn't work out that way. I think it's mainly because I put that pretty heavy chamfer on the back cover, but it ended up blowing out all those back pieces, and it just didn't look very good. So for the other 2 covers that I made, I just went through and drilled all the holes individually on both the front and back cover. And so this is where the jig really comes into play. So I'm packing in 24 pieces of this 100-pound black linen paper. Now, what's really nice about this linen paper is that it's a very heavyweight paper, so it feels really nice in the hand, and it's got this amazing texture on the back side. So on the front of the piece of paper that you're seeing on camera right now, it's just typical paper. It's very smooth, very nice. But on the back side, it's got this almost plaid type texture to it that feels so amazing. And so now we get to use the jig for its primary purpose, and that is drilling the hinge holes. So the whole purpose of this jig is to keep this paper and the front and back cover under extreme pressure when you're drilling these holes, because if you try to drill through paper with a drill bit when it's not under extreme pressure, it is just going to move around, it's going to slide around, it's going to do a whole bunch of stuff that you don't want to do. It's not going to leave you with a nice clean hole. Whereas if you can put it under a lot of pressure, it will actually hold in place and you'll be able to drill a perfectly clean 1/4 inch hole like we're doing here. So this was one of the best ideas that I had with this whole project. I was really concerned about having to punch all these holes accurately across a whole bunch of different pieces of paper, but just being able to put it in the jig, drill one hole at a time, really worked out well. These holes all came out perfectly aligned. All the paper in the final book is perfectly aligned with the back edge, and it just worked out way better than I ever could have imagined. And so these barrel bolts are what's going to allow this book to be easily modified in the future. It allows you to both add pages and easily take this whole thing apart to work on an individual page. Again, like I said at the beginning, it's way easier to work on one of these pieces of paper if it's flat on a desk. So you can take this whole book apart, take out that one piece of paper, work on it, and then put the whole book back together. These are really nice barrel bolts. They came from Lee Valley. They're solid brass, and they're really easy to replace. So if they get damaged, worn out, anything like that, all I have to do is pick up a couple from Lee Valley and put the cover back together. Now, this time of putting oil on these covers was absolutely amazing. On the cover that I made for myself, this is a laser engraving of my company logo, so that came out really beautifully. Also, the stippled cover was awesome once I got some oil on it, which you guys will get to see in just a second here.